Palpatine thought he killed his master. He was wrong. The apprentice who became Emperor, who ruled the galaxy for decades, who created Darth Vader himself, had been deceived from the very beginning. His master never died. Darth Plagueis survived, and he came back as Supreme Leader Snoke. This changes everything. Imagine it. The scarred ancient figure pulling the strings in the sequel trilogy wasn't some random dark side user. He was the original architect. The Sith Lord who taught Palpatine everything. The man who could cheat death itself. He watched the Clone Wars unfold. He saw the Empire rise and fall. He corrupted Ben Solo, and nobody knew who he really was. Until now. What if Supreme Leader Snoke was actually Darth Plagueis the Wise? Not just a theory, not just speculation. What if this was the truth that would have transformed the entire sequel trilogy into something far more sinister and connected than anyone imagined? This theory consumed Star Wars fans for years, and for good reason. Because if it were true, everything you know about the Skywalker saga would have to be rewritten. Let's start with the moment that changes everything. That opera house scene in Revenge of the Sith. Palpatine leans in close to Anakin and tells him about Darth Plagueis the Wise, a Sith Lord so powerful he could use the Force to create life and prevent death. He had such knowledge of the dark side that he could keep the ones he cared about from dying. Then Palpatine delivers the punchline with that sinister smile. The tragedy was that he taught his apprentice everything he knew, and then his apprentice killed him in his sleep. Ironic. He could save others from death, but not himself. Except what if he did save himself? What if that entire story was Palpatine's greatest lie, told to manipulate Anakin, but based on a truth that haunted Palpatine for his entire life? What if Plagueis used those very techniques Palpatine learned from him to survive the assassination attempt? What if he crawled back from the edge of death, scarred and broken, and waited in the shadows for decades, watching his former apprentice make mistake after mistake? Now, look at Snoke. Really look at him, ancient beyond measure, scarred as if he survived something catastrophic, powerful enough to bridge minds across the galaxy, knowledgeable about Sith and Jedi history in ways that suggest first-hand experience. He appears out of nowhere with no explanation, commanding the First Order with absolute authority, corrupting the grandson of Anakin Skywalker, and demonstrating Force abilities that seem to surpass even what Palpatine achieved. The scars on his head aren't random. They tell a story. A massive wound splits across his skull. His face looks reconstructed, as if the flesh had been torn apart and poorly healed. What could cause injuries like that? Force lightning, perhaps. The kind of overwhelming attack a betrayed Sith apprentice might use against his sleeping master. The kind of attack that should have killed him but didn't, because he knew the secret to cheating death. When The Force Awakens hit theaters in 2015, audiences were introduced to Supreme Leader Snoke, a towering holographic figure who commanded the First Order with absolute authority. He was powerful, ancient-looking, and seemed to possess intimate knowledge of the Force that rivaled even the Emperor himself. But here's the thing that bothered everyone. We had no idea who he was or where he came from. In a saga that meticulously connects its characters across generations, Snoke appeared out of nowhere with no explanation, no backstory, and no clear connection to the events we'd witnessed in 6 previous films. This vacuum of information became fertile ground for fan theories. And one theory rose above all others in popularity and plausibility. What if Snoke was Darth Plagueis? For those who need a refresher, Darth Plagueis was mentioned exactly once in the entire prequel trilogy, during that opera house scene in Revenge of the Sith. Palpatine tells Anakin the story of Darth Plagueis the Wise, a Sith Lord so powerful and so wise that he could use the Force to influence the midi-chlorians to create life. He had such a knowledge of the dark side that he could even keep the ones he cared about from dying. The tragedy, as Palpatine called it, was that he taught his apprentice everything he knew, and then his apprentice killed him in his sleep. Ironic. He could save others from death, but not himself, or could he? That's where this theory gets interesting. Let's examine why so many fans became convinced that Snoke and Plagueis were the same being. First, there's the physical appearance. Snoke looked ancient, far older than any human could naturally live, even in a galaxy far, far away. His face was scarred and deformed, suggesting he'd survived some catastrophic injury. His body appeared frail, almost mummified, yet he radiated power. This matches exactly what you'd expect from someone who had cheated death but paid a terrible physical price for it. The scars are particularly telling. Snoke's head bore a massive wound that split across his skull, and his face looked like it had been reconstructed after severe trauma. What if these weren't battle scars from some unknown conflict, but the physical evidence of his near-death experience at Palpatine's hands? What if Plagueis didn't fully die that night, but instead used his mastery over life and death to resurrect himself, emerging broken and scarred but alive? Then there's his age in the timeline. Snoke wasn't just old. He seemed impossibly ancient. He spoke with the weariness of someone who had witnessed eras come and go. The way he discussed the Force, the Jedi, and the Sith suggested first-hand experience spanning decades or even centuries. Darth Plagueis lived during the final years of the Old Republic, making him contemporary with the events leading up to the Phantom Menace. If he had survived his apparent death and lived in hiding for all those decades, he would be exactly this old by the time of the sequel trilogy. Consider his power level. Snoke wasn't just another dark side user. He was phenomenally powerful. He could connect minds across the galaxy, bridging Rey and Kylo Ren through the Force in a way we'd never seen before. He could dominate the will of someone as strong as Kylo Ren with apparent ease. He demonstrated abilities that seemed beyond what even Palpatine had shown in the original trilogy. Where would someone acquire this level of power? Well, if you were the master who trained Palpatine himself, if you were the Sith Lord who unlocked the secrets of life and death, you'd certainly qualify. But here's where it gets really fascinating. Look at what Snoke knew. He understood the history of the Jedi and Sith with intimate detail. He knew about Darth Vader, about the fall of the Empire, about the weakness of sentiment that led to Vader's redemption. He seemed to have insider knowledge of events he shouldn't have witnessed if he were just some random dark side user who emerged after the Empire's fall. But if he were Plagueis, if he had been watching from the shadows all along, then of course he would know these things. He would have watched his former apprentice build and lose an empire. He would have seen the rise and fall of Darth Vader. He would have witnessed it all, waiting for his moment to return. Let's talk about the musical evidence, because this is where things get truly interesting for those who pay attention to the details. John Williams, the legendary composer of Star Wars, has always used leitmotifs to connect characters and themes across the saga. When Palpatine speaks about Plagueis in Revenge of the Sith, there's a specific musical theme that plays. Now, here's the kicker. Elements of this theme appear in Snoke's musical motifs in The Force Awakens. Coincidence? In a franchise where Williams has been meticulous about musical storytelling for 4 decades? Many fans thought not. Andy Serkis, who portrayed Snoke through motion capture, gave interviews where he described Snoke as incredibly old and damaged, someone who had experienced great trauma. He spoke about the character in ways that suggested a deep backstory that predated the sequel trilogy. The secrecy surrounding Snoke's origins felt deliberate, as if there were a big reveal being held back for later films. Now let's dive into the what-if scenario. Imagine if this theory were true. How would it transform our understanding of the entire sequel trilogy, and indeed, the entire Skywalker saga? First, consider the brilliant irony it would create. The tragedy of Darth Plagueis, as Palpatine told it, was that the Master was killed by his apprentice. But what if Palpatine, for all his cunning and power, had been deceived? What if he thought he'd killed his master and claimed the Sith lineage for himself, but Plagueis had actually survived, using those very abilities Palpatine had learned from him to cheat death? The apprentice who thought he'd successfully betrayed his master would have actually been outplayed at his own game. This would mean that during all the events of the original trilogy, while Palpatine ruled the galaxy as Emperor, Plagueis was out there somewhere, watching, waiting, recovering. Perhaps he was too weak to challenge Palpatine directly after his resurrection. Perhaps he was biding his time, studying his former apprentice's tactics, learning from his mistakes. When Palpatine fell down that reactor shaft on the second Death Star, killed by his own apprentice in a mirror of what he'd done to Plagueis, imagine Plagueis' satisfaction. The cycle had repeated itself. But Plagueis wouldn't make the same mistakes. He'd seen how attachment destroyed Vader, how arrogance destroyed Palpatine. So when he re-emerged as Snoke and began building the First Order from the ashes of the Empire, he would have been more careful, more calculating. He would have learned from watching 2 generations of Skywalkers and 2 Sith Lords make fatal errors. This brings us to Ben Solo, and oh, how much more tragic his fall becomes under this interpretation. Imagine that Snoke isn't just some powerful dark side user who happened to corrupt Han and Leia's son. Imagine he's Darth Plagueis, the original architect of the Sith grand plan that Palpatine executed. Imagine he specifically targeted Ben because he was a Skywalker, because corrupting the grandson of Anakin Skywalker would be the ultimate victory. Think about what that means. Plagueis watched as his apprentice Palpatine tried and failed to fully corrupt Anakin. He watched Anakin fall to the dark side, but ultimately redeem himself through love for his son. He watched Luke Skywalker nearly rebuild the Jedi Order, and then he struck, not at Luke directly, but at his most vulnerable point: his nephew, his student, his family. By turning Ben Solo into Kylo Ren, Plagueis would have succeeded where Palpatine failed. He would have destroyed the Skywalker legacy from within. The seduction of Ben Solo would have been Plagueis' masterpiece. He wouldn't have used the crude methods of the past. No, he would have been subtle, patient, whispering doubts into Ben's mind across years. He would have exploited Ben's complicated feelings about his family legacy, his fear of his own power, his sense of being misunderstood. And crucially, he would have used the legend of Darth Vader, knowing that Ben idolized his grandfather without fully understanding him. This is where Snoke's famous line gains new depth. When he says to Kylo Ren, "You are no Vader, you are just a child in a mask," it's not just an insult. It's Plagueis comparing Kylo to someone he actually knew. He's comparing him to Anakin Skywalker, the chosen one whom Plagueis had observed from the shadows. He's telling Kylo that he doesn't measure up to the real thing, and he knows this because he was there for all of it. Now let's consider what this means for Rey. In the films, Rey's connection to the Force and her incredible natural abilities are eventually explained through her lineage. But in our what-if scenario, imagine that Snoke's interest in Rey wasn't coincidental. If he's Plagueis, the Sith Lord who could manipulate midi-chlorians to create life, wouldn't he take special interest in someone with Rey's unprecedented power? Perhaps he would see in her a tool, or a threat, or both. The connection between Rey and Kylo Ren that Snoke claims to have created takes on new meaning here. In The Last Jedi, Snoke reveals that he bridged their minds, creating their Force bond as a way to manipulate both of them. If he's Plagueis, this isn't just a neat Force trick. It's an extension of his ancient knowledge of how to manipulate the very fabric of life through the Force. He's literally connecting two powerful Force users across the galaxy, bending reality itself to serve his purposes. Think about the scene where Snoke tortures Rey while making Kylo watch. It's a test, a crucible designed to push Kylo further into darkness by forcing him to witness suffering and feel powerless. But for Plagueis, it's more than that. It's a lesson he learned from watching Palpatine's methods. Palpatine made Anakin watch Mace Windu's death and forced him to participate. Plagueis, having observed this, understands how witnessing violence can be as corrupting as performing it. Let's talk about Snoke's throne room, because the symbolism there becomes incredibly rich if he's Plagueis. The room is draped in red, the color of the Sith. The Praetorian Guards stand as silent sentinels, their red armor echoing the Emperor's royal guards, but evolved, perfected. Snoke sits elevated above all, commanding absolute obedience. But unlike Palpatine's throne room on the Death Star, which was cold and mechanical, Snoke's chamber has an organic quality to it, almost like a living thing. For someone who conquered death itself, whose power came from manipulating life, this aesthetic choice makes perfect sense. The moment when Kylo Ren kills Snoke becomes infinitely more ironic in this interpretation. Here we have the apprentice betraying the master, striking him down when he's distracted by his arrogance and certainty of victory. It's the exact same way Palpatine killed Plagueis. It's the exact same way Vader killed Palpatine. The cycle repeats once more, and Plagueis, if he were Snoke, would have been killed by the very pattern he helped establish millennia ago. The Sith rule of two, which demands that the apprentice eventually slay the master, claims its latest victim. The man who created this tradition becomes its victim for a second time. But wait, there's another layer here. If Snoke is Plagueis and Plagueis could cheat death, did Kylo actually kill him? Or did Plagueis allow himself to be struck down, having learned from watching Obi-Wan, Yoda, and even Palpatine that sometimes apparent death serves a greater purpose? The fact that Snoke seemed genuinely surprised when Kylo ignited the lightsaber argues against this. But then again, someone who had lived for centuries and mastered deception might be very good at acting surprised. Let's examine how this theory would reframe the First Order itself. In the films, the First Order is presented as remnants of the Empire reorganizing in the unknown regions. But if Snoke is Plagueis, the First Order becomes something far more sinister. It's not a remnant. It's a rebirth, guided by someone who helped Palpatine plan the fall of the Republic in the first place. Think about it. Plagueis and Palpatine spent years infiltrating the Republic, weakening it from within, creating the conditions for its collapse. The Clone Wars, the rise of the Empire, all of it was part of their grand plan. If Plagueis survived and became Snoke, then the First Order represents him taking another shot at the same goal. He's had decades to study what went wrong with the Empire. He knows that Palpatine's biggest weakness was his need for direct control and his inability to delegate true power. So Snoke creates a structure where fanatics like General Hux and dark side warriors like Kylo Ren do the work while he pulls strings from behind the scenes. The First Order's obsession with order and control, their willingness to use superweapons like Starkiller Base, their brutal efficiency, all of this echoes the Empire but refined, improved. Plagueis would have learned from the Empire's failures. The Death Star was destroyed twice by small groups of rebels exploiting design flaws. Starkiller Base is bigger, more powerful, built into a planet itself. It's the same concept but evolved, just as Plagueis himself evolved beyond death. Now, let's talk about the broader implications for the Skywalker saga. Star Wars has always been about the battle between generations, the sins of the fathers affecting their children, and the possibility of redemption. If Snoke is Plagueis, this theme becomes even more pronounced. You have Plagueis, the ancient Sith who set everything in motion by training Palpatine. Palpatine creates the Empire and corrupts Anakin Skywalker. Anakin falls but is redeemed by his son Luke. Luke tries to rebuild the Jedi, but fails when his nephew is corrupted by Plagueis in disguise as Snoke. Ben Solo. Now Kylo Ren eventually finds redemption through Rey, who represents a new hope untainted by the old conflicts. The poetry of this is undeniable. George Lucas always said Star Wars rhymes like poetry, with each generation echoing the last. If Snoke is Plagueis, then the sequel trilogy becomes the final verse in a poem that began with Plagueis and Palpatine plotting in the shadows. The villain of the sequels wouldn't be some newcomer, but the original architect of the saga's central conflict. Everything comes full circle. Consider also how this would affect our understanding of Palpatine's return in The Rise of Skywalker. In the actual film, Palpatine's resurrection feels somewhat random, a twist that wasn't properly set up. But if we lived in a timeline where Snoke was revealed to be Plagueis and Kylo had killed him, then Palpatine's return becomes a dueling resurrection storyline. Both master and apprentice cheated death, both came back to claim the galaxy, and now they're racing to see who will triumph in the end. Imagine a version of The Rise of Skywalker where Rey discovers that Palpatine has returned, but she also learns that Snoke was Plagueis, meaning both ancient Sith Lords are back from the dead. The stakes would be enormous. She wouldn't be facing just one enemy, but the legacy of both Sith Lords who started it all. The film could have explored the rivalry between Palpatine and Plagueis, two undead Sith battling for supremacy even as they tried to corrupt Rey and reclaim the galaxy. In this version, Plagueis' death at Kylo's hands could have been part of a larger plan. Maybe he needed to die again to fully transcend mortality, to become something beyond physical form. Maybe his consciousness survived and attempted to possess Kylo, creating an internal struggle where Ben Solo had to fight off the essence of the ancient Sith Lord. This would give Kylo's redemption arc, EV, wouldn't just be overcoming his own darkness, but literally expelling the spirit of Darth Plagueis from his being. Rey's role becomes even more crucial in this scenario. She's not just fighting to save the galaxy from Palpatine, she's fighting to end the cycle that Plagueis and Palpatine started together. Her victory wouldn't just be about defeating evil. It would be about breaking free from a pattern of master and apprentice betrayal that had plagued the Sith for millennia. When she takes the name Skywalker at the end, it's not just honoring Luke and Leia. It's claiming victory over the Sith Lords who spent generations trying to destroy the Skywalker family. Let's also consider the visual storytelling and symbolism. Snoke's appearance was designed by the filmmakers to evoke a sense of ancient evil. The gold robes he wore suggested wealth and decadence, calling back to the corruption of the Old Republic era when Plagueis would have been active. His throne room's red color scheme directly referenced the Sith aesthetic. Even his guards, the elite Praetorian Guard, wore red armor that seemed to evolve the concept of the Emperor's Royal Guard. All of these design, Choices would make perfect sense if he were meant to be Plagueis. He's literally bringing back the look and feel of the Sith era because he lived through it. The damaged, scarred appearance of Snoke takes on deeper meaning too. In the Legends continuity, specifically in the novel Darth Plagueis by James Luceno, we learn that Plagueis was a moon, an alien species with an elongated head and gaunt features. While Snoke didn't look exactly like a moon, his elongated, damaged skull could be interpreted as the remains of a moon who had been severely injured and poorly reconstructed. The scars that split his head could be from Palpatine's attack. The sunken, deformed features could be the price of cheating death. He came back, but not whole, not perfect. There's also the matter of Snoke's voice and manner of speaking. Andy Serkis gave him a distinct vocal quality, imperious, condescending, ancient. The way Snoke spoke suggested someone who had seen civilizations rise and fall, someone who viewed the current conflicts as merely the latest chapter in a very long story. This would be exactly how Darth Plagueis would sound, bored by the repetition of history, confident in his understanding of the patterns, contemptuous of those who couldn't see the bigger picture he saw. When Snoke mocks Kylo Ren's devotion to Vader's legacy, calling the helmet he wears a ridiculous mask, it takes on new significance. If Snoke is Plagueis, he's not just criticizing Kylo's methods. He's personally comparing Kylo to the real Darth Vader, whom Plagueis would have known about intimately. He watched Palpatine corrupt Anakin. He saw Vader at the height of his power. He witnessed Vader's redemption and death. So when he tells Kylo he's no Vader, he's speaking from first-hand knowledge. This also makes Snoke's interest in Vader's legacy more understandable. In The Force Awakens, Kylo has recovered Vader's melted helmet and speaks to it, asking for guidance. Snoke knows about this and seems to encourage it, at least initially. If he's Plagueis, this makes sense. He's using Vader's legend as a tool to manipulate Kylo, but he also has a personal connection to that legend. Vader was his apprentice's apprentice, in a sense. The Skywalker bloodline has been tangled up with Sith machinations since Plagueis and Palpatine's era. Let's examine the specific abilities Snoke demonstrates and how they connect to what we know about Plagueis. In The Last Jedi, Snoke shows the ability to bridge minds across vast distances, connecting Rey and Kylo despite them being on different planets. This is an incredibly advanced Force technique that we'd never seen before in Star Wars. But for someone who could manipulate the Force to create and preserve life, someone who understood midi-chlorians at a fundamental level, this would be entirely within their capabilities. The way Snoke tortures Rey by delving into her mind also suggests extraordinary Force sensitivity and power. He rips thoughts from her consciousness, viewing her memories and fears like reading a book. This level of mental domination is rare in Star Wars, typically only displayed by the most powerful Force users. Vader could sense Luke's thoughts, and Palpatine could manipulate minds on a massive scale, but Snoke's casual. Surgical precision in mind reading suggests someone with even deeper understanding of the Force. There's also Snoke's apparent knowledge of Force techniques from multiple traditions. He seems to understand both Jedi and Sith philosophy, light and dark side abilities. He speaks knowledgeably about balance in the Force, about the relationship between light and darkness. This comprehensive understanding would make sense for someone as old as Plagueis, who would have studied the Force for centuries and wouldn't be limited by the dogmatic views of any single tradition. Now let's address the elephant in the room. What actually happened in canon? In The Last Jedi, Snoke is killed by Kylo Ren. In The Rise of Skywalker, we learn through ancillary materials and implications in the film that Snoke was actually a creation of Palpatine, a puppet or artificial being created through Sith alchemy and cloning on Exegol. The novelization and other canon materials confirm that Snoke was essentially a bioengineered proxy, a meat puppet through which Palpatine could influence the galaxy, while he rebuilt his body and power in secret. This canonical explanation has its own interesting implications, but it definitively rules out the Plagueis theory. Snoke wasn't an ancient Sith Lord who cheated death. He was a manufactured being, possibly one of several identical models created to serve Palpatine's purposes. The scars and deformities weren't from surviving death, but from imperfect cloning or Sith experimentation. His power came from Palpatine channeling through him, not from his own ancient mastery. So why didn't the Plagueis theory come true? There are several likely reasons. First, creative direction changed between films. The Force Awakens was directed by J.J. Abrams, who deliberately left Snoke's origins mysterious. The Last Jedi was directed by Rian Johnson, who decided that Snoke's importance wasn't in his backstory, but in his role as an obstacle for Kylo Ren to overcome. Johnson has said in interviews that he felt revealing Snoke to be someone from the past would be less interesting than having him serve as a catalyst for Kylo's development. Second, there's the issue of Legends versus Canon. Darth Plagueis was explored in detail in James Luceno's novel Darth Plagueis, which was published before Disney acquired Lucasfilm. When Disney reset the canon, that novel became part of Legends, the non-canon timeline. While Palpatine's mention of Plagueis in Revenge of the Sith remains canon, all the detailed backstory from the novel is not. The filmmakers may have felt that bringing back a character whose canon presence amounted to one scene in one film wasn't the right move for the sequel trilogy. Third, the sequel trilogy was caught between multiple visions. J.J. Abrams started it with one set of ideas. Rian Johnson took it in a different direction with The Last Jedi. And then Abrams returned for The Rise of Skywalker with yet another shift. The lack of a cohesive plan from the beginning meant that seeds planted in The Force Awakens didn't necessarily grow the way fans expected. Snoke's mysterious introduction suggested importance, but subsequent creative decisions relegated him to a supporting role rather than the central villain. The decision to bring back Palpatine for The Rise of Skywalker essentially made Snoke redundant as a major villain. If the final film was going to be about confronting the Emperor's return, then Snoke's identity became less important. Making him a creation of Palpatine served the story Abrams wanted to tell in Episode 9, even if it contradicted fan expectations built up over the previous films. But here's the thing. The Plagueis theory resonated so strongly with fans for good reasons. It would have provided thematic coherence to the sequel trilogy and connected it meaningfully to the prequels. It would have made Snoke's presence feel earned rather than arbitrary. It would have given the sequels a sense of historical weight and consequence. When fans theorized that Snoke was Plagueis, they were engaging in exactly the kind of cross-trilogy thinking that made Star Wars special in the first place. The theory also represented fans trying to make sense of the sequel's place in the larger saga. If Snoke was just some random dark side user who happened to be powerful, he felt disconnected from the epic family drama of the Skywalker story. But if he were Plagueis, he'd be intrinsically woven into that drama from the very beginning. He'd be the catalyst whose actions with Palpatine set everything in motion generations ago. There's something almost poetic about how the theory evolved and spread through the fan base. People analyzed every frame of Snoke's appearances, every line of his dialogue, every musical cue. They dove deep into Legends material, reread the Darth Plagueis novel, and constructed elaborate timelines. The theorizing itself became a form of engagement with Star Wars mythology, a way for fans to participate in the storytelling process. What the Plagueis theory reveals is how much fans wanted the sequel trilogy to matter in the context of the larger saga. They wanted connections, callbacks, and revelations that would recontextualize everything that came before. They wanted to be surprised, but also to feel like the surprise was inevitable in retrospect, like all the pieces had been there all along waiting to be assembled. The Plagueis theory offered exactly that, a twist that would have been shocking yet, upon reflection, perfectly logical. Imagine the reaction if, at some point in The Last Jedi or The Rise of Skywalker, Snoke had been explicitly revealed as Plagueis. The internet would have exploded. People would have gone back and rewatched every film looking for clues they missed. The opera scene in Revenge of the Sith would have taken on entirely new significance. Palpatine's line about the irony of Plagueis not being able to save himself would become darkly funny, because he did save himself and Palpatine never knew. The reveal could have come in so many satisfying ways. Maybe Rey, searching through ancient Jedi texts, discovers the truth about Plagueis and realizes Snoke matches the description. Maybe Kylo Ren, after killing Snoke, finds records or artifacts that reveal who his master really was, adding another layer to his betrayal. Maybe Palpatine himself could have revealed it, boasting about how he thought he killed his master, but the old fool somehow survived, though not for much longer. The Force lightning that Snoke uses against Rey and in displays of his power carries particular significance if we consider him to be Plagueis. Force lightning is traditionally a Sith ability, one that requires deep connection to the dark side and considerable training. We've seen Palpatine use it extensively, Count Dooku employ it in combat, and even Yoda absorb and redirect it. But Snoke's use of it seems almost casual, effortless, as if it's second nature to him. This would make perfect sense for someone who not only mastered the technique millennia ago but potentially taught it to Palpatine himself. Every bolt of lightning Snoke throws would be a callback to his original apprentice, a reminder that he invented these techniques before Palpatine perfected them. The dynamic between Snoke and General Hux also deserves deeper examination. Hux is a true believer in the First Order's ideology, a fanatic who sees himself as continuing the Empire's work. But Snoke treats him with barely concealed contempt, viewing him as a useful tool rather than a valued subordinate. If Snoke is Plagueis, this attitude makes perfect sense. He's seen this type before. He watched the Empire rise and fall, saw countless officers and administrators come and go. Hux's passionate speeches about order and control must seem quaint, almost childish, to someone who orchestrated the fall of the old Republic itself. Plagueis would recognize that Hux's fanaticism is useful but ultimately shallow compared to the depths of the dark side. The relationship between Snoke and Kylo Ren also has fascinating parallels to historical Sith relationships if we view Snoke as Plagueis. The Sith have always operated on a master-apprentice dynamic, but that relationship has varied dramatically. Palpatine and Vader had a relationship built on mutual use and underlying resentment. Plagueis and Palpatine, according to Legends material, had a more collegial relationship initially, with Plagueis genuinely trying to teach his apprentice before Palpatine's ambition led to betrayal. Snoke and Kylo seem to split the difference. Snoke is teaching Kylo, grooming him, but there's always an undercurrent of manipulation and emotional abuse. He praises Kylo one moment and humiliates him the next, keeping his apprentice off balance and dependent. This psychological manipulation would be Plagueis learning from his mistakes. He was too trusting with Palpatine, treated him too much like an equal, and paid for it with his life. With Kylo, if Snoke is indeed Plagueis, he would be much more careful. He would never give Kylo enough knowledge or power to truly threaten him. He would keep Kylo perpetually insecure, always striving to prove himself, never quite achieving the validation he seeks. This is darker and more sophisticated than Palpatine's approach with Vader, which relied more on physical control through the suit and emotional control through guilt. Plagueis would have evolved beyond such crude methods. The test that Snoke sets for Kylo Ren, ordering him to kill Rey, is also worth examining through this lens. On the surface, it's a simple test of loyalty and commitment to the dark side. But if Snoke is Plagueis, it's much more than that. It's a test that Palpatine failed to properly administer to Vader. Palpatine wanted Vader to kill Luke, but when Vader refused and turned against him, Palpatine had no contingency plan. He died because he didn't properly account for the possibility of his apprentice's betrayal. Snoke, if he's Plagueis, would have learned from watching this. His test for Kylo isn't just about whether Kylo will kill Rey. It's about gauging Kylo's loyalty and detecting any signs of potential betrayal. The tragic irony is that Snoke still fails this test, just as Palpatine did. Despite all his centuries of experience, despite watching Palpatine's mistake firsthand, Plagueis as Snoke makes the same error. He becomes arrogant, so certain of his ability to read Kylo's intentions that he misses the betrayal happening right in front of him. When Kylo turns the lightsaber and strikes Snoke down, it's the ultimate proof that the Sith philosophy is self-defeating. No matter how wise the master, no matter how careful the precautions, the apprentice will always seek to overthrow them. It's built into the very foundation of Sith teaching. Let's delve deeper into what the reveal would have meant for the audience's understanding of The Force Awakens specifically. When we first see Snoke in that film, he appears only as a giant hologram, towering over Hux and Kylo Ren. This presentation is clearly meant to echo the Emperor's first appearance in The Empire Strikes Back, another holographic projection that made Palpatine seem larger than life. But if Snoke were revealed to be Plagueis, this visual choice gains additional meaning. Plagueis would be deliberately mimicking his former apprentice's methods, perhaps as a subtle mockery. He's saying, without words, that he knows all of Palpatine's tricks because he taught them to him in the first place. Snoke's damaged appearance in The Force Awakens, when we finally see him in person in The Last Jedi, has been the subject of endless speculation. The deep scar that bisects his head, the sunken features, the almost mummified quality of his skin, All of this suggests someone who has been through tremendous trauma. If he's Plagueis, we can imagine a specific scenario for how he got these injuries. Picture the night Palpatine betrayed him. Plagueis would have been caught off guard, perhaps in his sleep as the legend suggests, or perhaps in a moment of trust. Palpatine would have struck with overwhelming force, possibly using Force lightning to attack his master's brain directly, explaining the scarring pattern on Snoke's skull. But Plagueis' life's work was about conquering death, manipulating midichlorians to sustain life even when the body should fail. In his final moments, as Palpatine's attack ravaged his body, Plagueis would have used every technique he'd spent decades developing. He would have forced his midichlorians to keep his cells alive, to repair the catastrophic damage even as it was being inflicted. The result would be survival, but at a terrible cost. His body would be a patchwork of scarred tissue, barely held together by the Force. He would be alive, but grotesquely damaged. A walking testament to both his mastery over death and the price that mastery demands. The years following his near death would have been spent in hiding, slowly recovering, gathering strength. Plagueis would have watched from the shadows as Palpatine claimed the title of Dark Lord of the Sith, as he manipulated the Republic into war, as he transformed himself into the Emperor. Can you imagine Plagueis' emotions during this time? The rage at being betrayed, the grudging pride in seeing how well his apprentice executed their shared plan, the determination to eventually reclaim what was stolen from him. He would have been too weak to challenge Palpatine directly, so he would have waited, watched, and learned. During the Clone Wars, Plagueis would have observed Palpatine's machinations with the eye of a master craftsman watching his apprentice work. He would have noted the brilliance of playing both sides against each other, the cunning of hiding in plain sight as Supreme Chancellor, the audacity of manipulating the Jedi Order while living among them. But he would also have seen Palpatine's flaws. The unnecessary cruelty, the self-indulgent displays of power, the growing arrogance. Palpatine was effective, but he was also reckless in ways that Plagueis never would have been. The transformation of Anakin Skywalker into Darth Vader would have been particularly interesting to Plagueis. Here was the Chosen One, the being supposedly destined to bring balance to the Force, corrupted and turned into Palpatine's enforcer. Plagueis would have understood the significance of this more than anyone. After all, Plagueis himself had experimented with creating life through the Force. Some interpretations of the lore suggest that Plagueis' experiments might have inadvertently caused the Force to create Anakin as a response, a counterbalance to the Sith's manipulation of life itself. If this is true, and if Snoke is Plagueis, then his interest in the Skywalker family becomes deeply personal. Anakin might literally be his creation, an unintended consequence of his attempts to manipulate the midichlorians. Watching Vader's story unfold would have given Plagueis crucial insights into how to handle powerful Force users. He would have seen how Palpatine's approach, breaking Anakin down completely, encasing him in the suit, ruling through fear and pain, created a powerful servant, but also planted the seeds of eventual rebellion. When Vader threw Palpatine down the reactor shaft to save Luke, Plagueis would have understood that this was the inevitable result of Palpatine's methods. You can't maintain control through suffering alone. Eventually, the suffering becomes unbearable and the victim lashes out. This is why Snoke's approach to Kylo Ren, if he's Plagueis, is more psychologically sophisticated. Instead of breaking Kylo down, Snoke builds him up in twisted ways. He validates Kylo's anger at Luke, encourages his identity as the heir to Vader's legacy, and makes him feel special and understood. But he also keeps Kylo insecure by constantly criticizing him, comparing him unfavorably to Vader, and demanding more. This creates a psychological dependence that's harder to break than physical control. Kylo doesn't want to escape Snoke. He wants to prove himself to Snoke. That's a much more stable master-apprentice dynamic than what Palpatine had with Vader. The fall of the Empire would have been a moment of vindication for Plagueis. His former apprentice, the one who betrayed him, was finally dead, killed by his own apprentice in a poetic repetition of the Sith cycle. But Plagueis wouldn't have seen this as a tragedy. He would have seen it as an opportunity. The Empire was gone, the Jedi were nearly extinct, and the galaxy was in chaos. It was the perfect time for someone with vision and experience to step in and reshape everything according to a new design. The creation of the First Order would have been Plagueis' grand experiment, his chance to improve upon Palpatine's empire. He would have learned from the Empire's mistakes, The Empire was too centralized, too dependent on Palpatine's personal rule. When the Emperor died, it collapsed rapidly. The First Order would be different. It would be more ideological, more fanatical, less dependent on any single leader. Snoke would guide it, but the true power would be in the system itself. In the belief structure he created, the recruitment and indoctrination methods of the First Order also reflect lessons learned from the Empire. The Empire relied heavily on fear and oppression to maintain control, which created resentment and fueled the rebellion. The First Order, while still brutal, focuses more on creating true believers. They take children and raise them as stormtroopers, indoctrinating them from birth. They promote an ideology of order and strength that appeals to those who feel the new republic is weak and chaotic. This is a more insidious and potentially more stable form of control than the Empire's crude tyranny. Starkiller Base, the First Order's ultimate weapon, represents both continuity and evolution from the Empire's approach. Like the Death Stars before it, it's a superweapon designed to inspire fear and demonstrate overwhelming power. But it's also improved in almost every way. It's built into a planet rather than being a constructed station, making it harder to destroy. It can drain stars for power and fire across the galaxy, making it far more powerful than the Death Stars. If Snoke is Plagueis, this weapon represents his understanding that Palpatine's concept was sound, but the execution was flawed. Make it bigger, make it stronger, make it harder to destroy. And maybe this time it will work. Of course, Starkiller Base is destroyed anyway, blown up by a small team of resistance fighters in a plot that deliberately mirrors the destruction of both Death Stars. If Snoke is Plagueis, this must have been incredibly frustrating. Despite all his improvements and all his planning, history repeated itself anyway. The superweapon fell to the same basic tactic, a small team exploiting a vulnerability. It's a reminder that in Star Wars, massive shows of force are always vulnerable to hope, courage, and determination. The dark side can build weapons that destroy planets, but it can't account for the unpredictable nature of individuals who refuse to give up. The failure of Starkiller Base might have been what pushed Snoke to focus more intensely on Kylo Ren and Rey. Superweapons can be destroyed, armies can be defeated, but if you control powerful Force users, you control something more fundamental. This brings us back to the Force bond between Rey and Kylo that Snoke claims to have created. In The Last Jedi, Snoke boasts that he bridged their minds, connecting them across the galaxy for his own purposes. If true, and if Snoke is Plagueis, this is perhaps his greatest achievement, surpassing even his conquest of death. Think about what this means. Snoke would have reached across the galaxy, found two powerful Force users who were enemies, and connected their very consciousnesses. They can see each other, speak to each other, even touch each other across impossible distances. This goes beyond any Force technique we've seen before. Palpatine could communicate across the galaxy through the Force, but only in vague one-way transmissions. Vader could sense Luke's presence and feelings, but creating a genuine two-way connection where two people can interact as if they're in the same room despite being on different planets, that's unprecedented. For Plagueis, who spent his life studying how to manipulate life through the Force, this would be the culmination of his research. He's not just sustaining life or creating it. He's connecting it, manipulating the fundamental bonds that link living beings through the Force. If he can do this with two people, what else might he be capable of? Could he connect entire populations, controlling them like puppets? Could he drain life from one person and give it to another? The possibilities are terrifying and suggest that Plagueis' power had grown far beyond what Palpatine ever achieved. The relationship between Rey and Kylo, their strange connection that's part antagonism and part understanding, becomes much more sinister if it was artificially created by Snoke. In the films, their bond is treated as something almost romantic, a connection of souls that transcends their differences. But if Snoke created it, it's a violation of their autonomy, their minds literally manipulated and linked without their consent. Rey and Kylo think they're feeling genuine emotions, genuine understanding, but it's all part of Snoke's design. He's playing them like instruments, making them dance to his tune without them even realizing it. This manipulation becomes even darker when we consider Snoke's ultimate plan. In The Last Jedi, he brings Rey before him, tortures her to draw out the location of Luke Skywalker, and then orders Kylo to kill her. But what if this was never really the plan? What if Snoke intended for Kylo to turn on him? What if the entire scenario was designed to push Kylo into killing his master? making him think it was his own choice when really he was following a script Snoke had written. This might sound counterintuitive. Why would Snoke want to die? But consider that Plagueis conquered death once before. What if death has become just another tool for him? Another state of being he can move in and out of at will. When Kylo strikes him down, perhaps Plagueis is already moving to his next vessel, his next body, his next identity. The scarred and damaged form of Snoke might have been just one incarnation, a role he played until it was no longer useful. This brings us to one of the most intriguing possibilities of the Plagueis theory. What if Snoke's death was meant to be the catalyst for Plagueis to possess Kylo Ren? In many dark side traditions, killing your master is part of the rite of passage, the moment when you claim their power. But what if that's not metaphorical? What if, when you strike down a master who truly understands the secrets of life and death, you open yourself up to their essence, their consciousness? Kylo killing Snoke could have been the moment when Plagueis' spirit attempted to take over Kylo's body, to possess the powerful young Skywalker and claim him as his new vessel. If this were the case, Kylo's internal struggle throughout the rest of The Last Jedi and into The Rise of Skywalker would take on new meaning. His uncertainty, his conflict, his inability to fully commit to either the dark or the light. What if this wasn't just his own confusion, but an actual battle inside his mind? What if Plagueis' consciousness was fighting for control, trying to subsume Ben Solo's identity and use his body as a new vessel? Kylo's eventual redemption, his return to being Ben Solo, would then be him successfully expelling Plagueis' essence and reclaiming his own identity. This concept would tie beautifully into Star Wars' broader themes about identity and choice. The saga has always been about characters defining themselves in opposition to their legacies and expectations. Luke had to choose not to become his father. Anakin had to choose whether to save Padme or claim power. Rey had to choose what kind of Jedi she would be. Kylo having to literally fight off the possessing spirit of an ancient Sith Lord who wants to steal his body would be the ultimate version of this theme. It's not just rejecting a legacy. It's fighting for the very ownership of your own mind and soul. Rey's role in all of this becomes even more crucial in this interpretation. If the bond between her and Kylo was created by Snoke as Plagueis, then that bond might be the key to saving Kylo from Plagueis' possession. Their connection, which Plagueis meant to use to control and manipulate them, could become the very thing that defeats him. Rey could reach through the bond into Kylo's consciousness and help him fight off Plagueis' spirit. Their connection, which started as... If Snoke were Plagueis, this theme would be embodied in the villain himself. He would literally be the past refusing to die, an ancient evil that keeps coming back no matter how many times it's defeated. The heroes wouldn't just be fighting a person. They'd be fighting history itself, the accumulated weight of generations of Sith philosophy and dark side corruption. Their victory would be about more than defeating an enemy. It would be about finally breaking the cycle, ending the pattern of master and apprentice betrayal that had plagued the Sith for millennia. The visual storytelling opportunities of revealing Snoke as Plagueis would have been extraordinary. Imagine a scene where Snoke's true identity is revealed, perhaps through a Force vision or ancient holocron. We could see flashbacks to his life before his apparent death, showing him as a powerful Sith Lord working alongside a younger Palpatine. We could see the moment of his betrayal, Palpatine's attack in vivid detail, showing exactly how Snoke got his scars. We could see his long recovery in the shadows, his body slowly knitting itself back together through sheer force of will and dark side power. These flashbacks could be rendered in a visual style that distinguishes them from the present-day scenes, perhaps with a desaturated color palette or a grainier film quality that evokes the prequels. This would create a visual link to that era while also making it clear that we're seeing ancient history. The audience would understand viscerally that Snoke is not just old, but ancient. A being from a different time who has somehow survived into the present. The moment of revelation itself could be structured to maximum dramatic effect. Perhaps Rey, in her search for answers about Snoke after his death, discovers records from the old Jedi temple. She finds mentions of Darth Plagueis, descriptions of his appearance and his research into midi-chlorian manipulation. She sees artistic renderings or holographic records of what Plagueis looked like before his scarring, and she realizes with growing horror that the bone structure, the shape of the skull, matches Snoke's damaged features. The scars aren't just scars. There a map of where Plagueis was injured during Palpatine's assassination attempt. When she brings this information to Leia, we could have a powerful scene where Leia reveals that she knew, or at least suspected. She could explain that when she was young, she accessed some of the Emperor's private records and found references to Plagueis, including warnings Palpatine had written to himself about the possibility that his master might have survived. Palpatine was paranoid about many things, and the idea that Plagueis could have used his own techniques to cheat death would have haunted him. Leia could tell Rey that this is why Palpatine was always searching for immortality, always experimenting with cloning and essence transfer. He wasn't just power-hungry. He was terrified that his master would return and claim revenge. This revelation would add layers to Palpatine's character as well. In the prequels, he seems supremely confident and in control. In the original trilogy, he's arrogant and certain of his power. But if there was always a shadow of doubt in the back of his mind, a fear that Plagueis might not be truly dead, it adds a touch of vulnerability to his character. Even the Emperor, the most powerful being in the galaxy, had something he was afraid of. The political implications of the Plagueis reveal would also be fascinating to explore. When the galaxy learns that the Supreme Leader of the First Order was actually an ancient Sith Lord from the Old Republic era, it would shake public understanding of recent history. The First Order claimed to be a legitimate successor to the Empire, bringing order to a chaotic galaxy. But if it was founded and led by a Sith Lord who was even older and more corrupt than Palpatine, it would delegitimize the First Order completely in the eyes of many who had supported it. This could lead to mass defections from the First Order as soldiers and officers realize they've been serving not a political movement but an ancient evil. General Hux, who thought he was building a new order for the galaxy, would have to confront the fact that he was just another pawn in a game played by beings who were old when his great-grandparents were young. The ideological crisis this would create within the First Order could be as destructive as any military defeat. On the other side, the Resistance would gain a clearer sense of what they're fighting against. It's not just remnants of the Empire or a new political movement. It's the same evil that corrupted the Old Republic, created the Clone Wars, and built the Empire. The fight is bigger than they thought, more important. They're not just fighting for the New Republic. They're fighting to end a cycle of corruption that has plagued the galaxy for generations. The Jedi Order's history with the Sith would also come into sharper focus. The Jedi failed to detect Palpatine even though he was right under their noses for years. They failed to prevent the rise of the Empire. They failed to stop Vader. If Plagueis has also been operating in the shadows, influencing events for decades, it's another massive failure for the Jedi. Rey, as the heir to the Jedi tradition, would have to grapple with this legacy of failure. The Jedi were supposed to be guardians of peace and justice, but they were outmaneuvered at every turn by the Sith. What does that say about the Jedi Order? What would a new Jedi Order need to do differently to avoid the same mistakes? This self-examination could lead to Rey creating a fundamentally different kind of Jedi Order. One that doesn't rely on the old hierarchies and dogmas that made the previous order so vulnerable to Sith manipulation. She could incorporate lessons from Luke's failures, from the fall of the Old Order, and from her own experiences to create something new. The revelation that Snoke was Plagueis could be the catalyst for this reimagining of what it means to be a Jedi. The connection to the world between worlds, introduced in the Star Wars Rebels animated series, offers another interesting angle. The world between worlds is a mystical realm within the Force that exists outside normal time and space, allowing access to different moments in history. If Plagueis knew about this realm, if he had learned to access it, it would explain how he could have survived and influenced events across such a long time span. He wouldn't just be living through the years normally. He would be stepping in and out of time itself, appearing at crucial moments to nudge history in the direction he wanted. This would make him not just a survivor, but a temporal manipulator, someone who exists partially outside the normal flow of time. It would explain his seemingly impossible knowledge of events and his ability to plan across multiple generations. He's not just guessing what will happen. He's seen it, or at least glimpsed possibilities of it through his access to this temporal realm. Every move he makes is informed by knowledge that no one else possesses. The philosophical implications of this are staggering. If Plagueis can access different time periods, can he change the past? Could he have influenced his own past, creating the very circumstances that led to his rise? This brings in questions of predestination versus free will that have always been central to Star Wars but would be taken to a new level. Are Rey and Kylo really making their own choices, or are they following paths that Plagueis laid out for them by manipulating time itself? The answer, in keeping with Star Wars' humanistic themes, would ultimately have to be that free will prevails. No matter how much Plagueis manipulates time, no matter how much he plans and schemes, he can't control the human heart. Love, compassion, and the choice to do good are forces that exist outside his calculations. This is why Vader turned against Palpatine, why Kylo turns against Snoke, and why Rey chooses to be a Jedi despite the easier path of the dark side. The Sith, for all their power, can never fully account for the capacity of people to choose light over darkness. In conclusion, while the theory that Snoke was Darth Plagueis didn't pan out in canon, exploring what could have been reveals just how rich the Star Wars mythology is and how many possibilities exist within it. The theory wasn't just fan speculation. It was fans engaging with the material at a deep level, making connections across films and eras, and imagining how the pieces could fit together in satisfying ways. If Snoke had been Plagueis, the sequel trilogy would have been transformed into something even more ambitious and interconnected. It would have been a story spanning the entire 9-film saga, from the machinations of ancient Sith lords in the shadows of the Old Republic to their final defeat at the hands of a new generation. It would have given Snoke depth and importance beyond just being an obstacle for Kylo Ren to overcome. It would have made every film in the saga feel more essential, more connected to a larger tapestry. The thematic resonance would have been powerful. The idea that evil doesn't die, that it keeps returning in new forms, would be literalized in Plagueis repeatedly surviving death. But equally, the idea that each generation has to fight its own battles and can't rely on the past would be embodied in Rey and her friends, facing threats that even their legendary predecessors couldn't fully defeat. They would be tested in ways the previous generation wasn't, forced to confront an enemy who had learned from every previous conflict. Rey's ultimate victory would have carried even more weight. She wouldn't just be defeating Palpatine or Snoke or the First Order. She would be ending the Sith lineage completely, defeating both the apprentice and the master, destroying the dark side tradition that had caused so much suffering across generations. When she takes the name Skywalker at the end, it wouldn't just be honoring Luke and Leia. It would be claiming victory over the forces that tried to destroy the Skywalker family since Anakin was a child. The tragedy of Kylo Ren would also deepen. He thought he was following in Vader's footsteps, but he was actually being manipulated by someone who was pulling strings even before Vader existed. His entire journey, from his corruption to his redemption, would be shadowed by Plagueis' influence. His choice to reject the dark side and save Rey would be all the more powerful because it would mean breaking free not just from his own anger, but from manipulation that had been targeting him since before he was born. For Finn, Poe, and the other heroes, the reveal would contextualize their struggle. They're not just fighting another empire. They're fighting the culmination of a plot that began before the Clone Wars. Their courage and determination in the face of such ancient and powerful evil would make their heroism even more impressive. They don't have special bloodlines or force powers, most of them, but they fight anyway because it's the right thing to do. The Force itself would be recontextualized by the Plagueis reveal. If he truly mastered the ability to manipulate life and death through the Force, it raises questions about the nature of the Force itself. Is it a tool that can be mastered and controlled, or is it a living energy that ultimately resists manipulation? The answer, suggested throughout Star Wars, is that the Force has a will of its own. Plagueis might be able to delay death, to manipulate midi-chlorians, to create connections between minds, but he can't control the Force completely. It pushes back, creates balance in response to his actions, and ultimately ensures that his evil is defeated. The visual and auditory callback possibilities would have been endless. Imagine John Williams creating musical bridges between Snoke's themes and the Plagueis motif from Revenge of the Sith, building a sonic narrative of the same character across decades. Imagine visual effects artists crafting scenes that show Plagueis' midi-chlorian manipulation as visible energy, making the invisible mechanisms of the Force tangible for the first time. Imagine costume designers showing the evolution of Plagueis' appearance from his original form through his scarred Snoke incarnation, telling a story through purely visual means. The marketing opportunities alone would have been extraordinary. The reveal could have been saved for the theater, creating a genuine surprise moment that would have dominated cultural conversation for months. Alternatively, it could have been teased in trailers, building anticipation and speculation. The merchandising, the tie-in novels, the animated series, all of it could have explored different aspects of Plagueis' long life and his influence on galactic history. More importantly, the reveal would have validated the prequel trilogy in a way that many fans would have appreciated. By making a prequel-era character central to the sequels, it would have sent a clear message that all of Star Wars matters, that the saga is one continuous story rather than discrete trilogies that barely connect. It would have encouraged fans to rewatch all 9 films looking for connections and clues, finding new meaning in scenes they'd watched dozens of times before. The novelizations, comics, and other expanded materials could have gone deep on Plagueis' history, filling in the decades between his apparent death and his re-emergence as Snoke. We could learn what he did during the Clone Wars, how he felt watching Palpatine rule the Empire, what his reaction was to Vader's redemption. We could see him gathering resources, building the foundations of what would become the First Order, recruiting followers who didn't even know who he really was. Every new piece of material would add layers to the overall story. The fan community would have had years of material to discuss and analyze. The debates about Snoke's identity that consumed forums and YouTube channels during the sequel trilogy's release would have been validated, proven correct. The theorists who spent hours analyzing every frame and every line of dialogue would have been rewarded for their attention to detail. It would have strengthened the relationship between Star Wars and its fandom, showing that careful attention to the material could lead to genuine insights about where the story was going. Perhaps most importantly, the Plagueis reveal would have made the sequel trilogy feel essential rather than supplementary. One of the criticisms of the sequels is that they don't add much to the overall saga, that they essentially retread the same ground as the original trilogy without contributing new ideas. But if they revealed and defeated Plagueis, if they ended the Sith once and for all by destroying both Palpatine and his master, they would be completing something the original trilogy left unfinished. They would be the necessary conclusion to a story that began in the prequels, continued through the originals, and finally ended with the sequels. The sequel trilogy would also gain the kind of tragic inevitability that makes the best Star Wars stories so compelling. We would know from the beginning that Plagueis was out there, that he was planning and scheming, that conflict was inevitable. The heroes wouldn't be fighting a war that could have been avoided. They would be fighting a war that was set in motion before they were born, trying to end a cycle of violence and corruption that had plagued the galaxy for generations. Their struggle would be part of something larger than themselves, and their victory would mean breaking a pattern that seemed unbreakable. In our timeline, Snoke was just a puppet, a tool created by Palpatine to serve his purposes. In the timeline where Snoke was Plagueis, he would have been the ultimate villain, the architect of generations of suffering, the shadow behind the throne who finally stepped into the light for one last attempt at dominance. His defeat would have meant something profound, the end of an era and the beginning of something new. So even though the theory didn't come true, even though Snoke remained a mysterious figure who was killed before we learned much about him, the Plagueis theory remains one of the most interesting and elaborate fan theories in Star Wars history. It showed how deeply fans engage with the material, how much they care about the connections and continuity, and how creative they can be in imagining possibilities that the official stories haven't explored. And who knows? In a franchise where death is rarely permanent, where legends become reality and the past is never truly gone, maybe somewhere in some future Star Wars story, we'll finally learn what really happened to Darth Plagueis the Wise. Maybe he's still out there in some form, waiting for the right moment to return. After all, if he could cheat death once, who's to say he couldn't do it again? The galaxy far, far away is vast and full of mysteries, and Plagueis, the Sith Lord who conquered death itself, might be the greatest mystery of all. His story might not be over. In Star Wars, nothing ever truly ends. It all just transforms, evolves, and comes back around in new and unexpected ways. That's the magic of this universe, the reason fans keep coming back generation after generation. The stories never truly end. They just pause, waiting for the right moment to continue.